Welcome to the Public Voice Salon. My name is John Bredin. We're a progressive on-air dialogue on culture, politics, and the critical issues of our time. Today we're broadcasting from the Symposia Community Bookstore in Hoboken because we do love to be in community spaces. One of the things we like to do is create dialogue and outreach with the public. And I'm so happy today to be with David Cogswell. It's very interesting because David is one of the great thinkers of our community and of our country, really. I mean, the work that he's been doing, he's written books on Noam Chomsky, on Howard Zinn, on existentialism. His latest book is about unions, and he's just covering the material that's so necessary, I think, for Americans to learn about now. In particular, he's writing for the Beginners series, and I think that's even more important for people who don't know this stuff to really become educated. Just a reminder to people, I am an educator. I teach at Essex County College in Newark, and I have a sort of a close-up view of the education system and the deficiencies and how the dumbing down that's happening in our country. It's interesting that we're in a bookstore here because David also had a bookstore which I believe was located right next door to where we are now, 2 doors down, back in the 1980s when Hoboken became a model city in the country for gentrification, for better or worse, whether you like gentrification or not. You know, but David was part of the artistic, cultural, intellectual element of that gentrification, which I think we could all welcome and we could say that we all need more of. So people might be walking back and forth here. We're in a vital, open public space. I'm so happy to have David Cogswell with us, a man who's very much a part of the community. He writes letters to the editor. I frequently see his pieces. Most recently, he wrote a piece about Maxwell's, our wonderful music venue, which is closing, a cultural space that's been around for decades, where bands like REM and played and got their careers started, and we're losing that. David wrote a wonderful piece in the Hoboken Reporter mourning that loss and also presaging what that could mean in terms of, maybe I'm paraphrasing here, but of Hoboken becoming a more boring place as we lose that artistic, cultural element. But I want to hand the microphone over to David, and maybe we could begin the conversation with his most recent book, which is called Unions for Beginners. We see the union movement now in our country is so low, it's been pushed down to, I think, only 6% of the workforce is unionized, where at one time it was like 35%. And David, let me just ask you to talk a little bit and reflect on why you wrote this book and what you think needs to be done to get the union movement strong again.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much. I'm honored to be on your show. I so appreciate what you're doing, and obviously it fits right into the kind of things that I'm interested in as well. The book on unions came about because, as you say, the union movement has diminished tremendously in its impact on the country, and at the same time that it has diminished, the middle class has gone down in number and in economic leverage and so forth. So a lot of the things that I'd been looking at and researching for the last 20 or 30 years, just in terms of where my country is going and what's happening, how it's evolving, and particularly what happened to cause such a precipitous fall in the fortunes of my people. The middle-class Americans are having a very, very hard time, and it's been a steady decline for a long time. And discovering that it goes along or parallels the decline of the unions was a very interesting thing to discover. And it also parallels in opposite directions, or the rise of corporate power. And as I looked at the problems, all the problems that I saw in the world, the reduction of democracy and the reduction of the quality of life of Americans, and as you talked about, the dumbing down, the whole host of issues in that area, the expansion of corporate power kept coming to the fore. And I think that you see that the major corporations basically control the country now. They pretty much control the Congress through donations, as they're called, maybe bribes they once were called. They now have the Supreme Court is very pro-corporate power. They control the media, so they essentially, I mean, you have what, 3 or 4 corporations who control almost all the media in the country. So they control the message, they control our cultural message. They have so much control over our country. I think people don't realize how much major corporations control the way we think, our value system. So, and I saw, as I was researching things like with the Chomsky book, the Zen book, that when you have a situation where the power is so tied up by the corporate state that there's very little legitimate avenue, very few legitimate avenues for a citizen to express himself in a democratic way anymore, in a way that really makes any difference. And I found that one of the only ways to oppose that kind of concentrated capital power in history has been unions. And we tend to think of unions in relation to the trades, in relation to factories, but the real principle is people banding together, and it has been what has built the middle class to a very large degree. So that's what brought me around to it, and that's where we are.
You talk about, David, also people pulling together. You've written about this in the civil rights movement, and to stop the Vietnam War, that all these processes involve human beings getting together and working together and collaborating, connecting with each other, and that one person alone trying to stop all this madness is just like, a lone wolf. It's very hard to do it by yourself. So I agree with that as an English professor, as someone who talks about language and is interested in interconnection and dialogue, and I think also people are so depressed today, people are so exhausted. They're going from work to home, and because they haven't been educated properly because of the dumbing down, and even at the college level now, I see this, that the education has become very narrow and very technocratic and very gearing towards work, so they're training people to function as sort of robotized, workers, whether it's usually or in a corporate factory, in a cubicle. You're not going to answer back. You're going to be passive. You're not going to be able to think critically, or you're not even going to know, as you also wrote about the unions in the lecture that you gave at the Hoboken Library about this topic, where you said that that the knowledge is not even out there now, that people are not learning. They don't even know that there was such a thing as a union movement. So how do we get out of this mess? How do we get back to each other? Another thing I find very interesting, there's a wonderful book by Kim Phillips Fine called Invisible Hands, The Businessmen's Crusade Against the New Deal. Starting in 1934, the DuPonts founded this organization called the American Liberty League, and it was really a propaganda group to really go after FDR. And ever since then, the right wing has had these think tanks and organizations where, they were out in the cold for decades because America was a liberal country in the 40s and 50s and 60s, but they kept plugging away and they kept writing position papers, and they kept. One of the people who they recruited was Ronald Reagan. When Reagan worked for General Electric, he became a spokesperson, and it's a fascinating book, this by Fine, where she really documents how this country has been pushed to the right. And so I think more and more we need spaces like this, community spaces where we can talk to each other, where we can organize, and even thinking about a media. What do you think could it be possible for progressives to have their own media that's on a level of a CNBC or a Fox or something like that? Because when you go home at night and you go back and forth between Rachel Maddow and Sean Hannity, you don't have much of a choice there. And certainly Maddow and Ed Schultz are better than Hannity and O'Reilly, but they're also kind of huge to the Democratic Party line. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, you've said many good things there, and many of them I appreciate your stating them. I couldn't say them better. The situation with Rachel Maddow, for example, that's a good example. I mean, I like her very much, but you still have a situation where NBC is a big war contractor, and I mean, it's owned by General Electric, I think. I mean, you have a very small range of points of view out there, and so I think those people are able to cover certain areas, but they're not able to cover other areas, and a lot of things stay off the table, and you have very little diversity. What we had those really good laws for the FCC to regulate these. We forget that these things are public. You know, the airwaves are public. They're like rivers and oceans. We all own them, and they get licensed to these corporations. I don't think they pay for the licenses. Maybe they do, but it isn't very much compared to what they make. And they're ours. They're not theirs. But they treat them totally as their own property. And there's no room for the whole range of public opinion. There's the middle class, the minorities are not really represented in that very narrow. It's the old 1% thing. So it's a bad scene, and I think you're right that as far as trying to find inroads into the national dialogue, it's very difficult. What you have is you really do have the 1%, and then you have the 99%. But as you pointed out, a large part of the 99% is very well indoctrinated and don't know what they're missing, or what they really believe that this ideology that they carry in their heads, they don't realize how much that was preached to them and given to them all these years by the corporate media. So you find what you still have is large numbers of people looking to find ways in there. So you have, for example, film. There are very good films these days. What's lacking in the public, in the TV area, is often made up for to some degree, at least in film. So you have some very good journalism and good investigatory reporting done in films now. And then you have obviously the web that produces opportunities for other points of view. The corporate people are trying very hard to lock that down, the same way they have, FM radio and everything else. But those are the kinds of hopes. It's interesting. I just this afternoon had an interview with a young woman from Cairo. And she was telling me, you're not getting the picture. Like, CNN isn't telling you what this is. This is not a military coup. She said the military came to our aid. This is the People's Revolution playing out. We got off to a rough start, and now this is a good turn in it. So it's interesting to see that kind of thing, Facebook and Twitter, and people slipping through the big channels and getting things more directly to people. So it's an exciting time in that way.
I'm excited by the fact that 33 million Egyptians rose up and took to the streets in a country of only 80 million people. That's almost half of the population took to the streets and rose up. Imagine if that happened here in the United States of America, the kind of changes that we could get. And even David Brooks today, who tends to be more in the center or more, conservative, he wrote a column today where he's very supportive of what happened in Egypt and with the military stepping in, because you had an autocratic, Muslim Brotherhood that wasn't, just like we have an autocratic government here in the United States now, and autocracy needs to be rooted out wherever it is. But one of the books that David wrote about, one of the people he wrote about was Noam Chomsky. And I want to just hold this up. This is one of David's books, Noam Chomsky for Beginners. And certainly Chomsky, who spoke recently at the Left Forum in New York, Claudia and I were there, and he's still very much out there on the road and doing his thing, although he's probably not invited onto corporate media as much as he should be. And there was a couple of quotes, a couple of thoughts that just stood out for me when I was reading this, David, and I wrote them in the margin, and I just want to let you know what they were. You said here that, let's see here, okay, all right, you said that in all of American history, no one's writings are more unsettling than Chomsky's. I thought that was very, very interesting. And the other thing I really like, you say that one of the wonderful things about Chomsky is that he makes us all feel so smart. And it's kind of like the things that we all suspect are true, the common sense elevated to genius, And so could you talk a little bit about Chomsky and how you first, came to his ideas, or what? Was this the first beginner's book that you wrote?
It was. It was back in '96, a long time ago. And I became aware of him. I'm not sure exactly, but the different things I was looking into kept coming back to him. And when I discovered him, he really was an amazing experience of sort of having the veil lifted, and seeing he had such a good way of describing and explaining what is going on and why things are the way they are. And it's very powerful. I certainly don't agree with everything that he ever said. I don't find myself always agreeing with him, but he opens a new world really to look at. And he and his partner in Edward Herman, I think, in Manufacturing Consent, were very scientific in the way they analyzed what was going on with the media. And Carl Jung said science is a way of forcing the truth down the reluctant throat. It's like if you have scientific backing, in this case it would be like just mathematics and analysis and so forth of who is what, and like, for example, how much a particular subject is covered versus another subject in the American media. They would count the number of lines. And it was the results were so striking. So you had a fundamental theory that was very, very illuminating in terms of what's going on, and they backed it up with all this powerful research and numbers and so forth. So it gives you a new way of looking at the world, and then you can go on from there, and you can agree or disagree with various points, but you have this new paradigm, really.
Yes. And other books that David has written include a book on Howard Zinn, who wrote The People's History of the United States, which was the first history actually from the viewpoint of the losers, or the people who were never written about before. Usually history is written from the standpoint of the powerful, of the wealthy, of the generals and the presidents and the kings. And Howard Zinn went out and wrote this book, I think in 1980 it was published. And David wrote a book, Howard Zinn for Beginners. Talk a little bit about Zinn, and do you think more people should be reading Zinn?
Oh, actually, it would be great if everybody would read People's History of the United States. It's a fairly thick book. It'll take a little while to read, but it will change the way you perceive history. And and now you have many people following in his footsteps. You have many other people exploring details in different areas with that frame of mind. As you said, it's looking at it from the standpoint of the people, just the basic people, as opposed, and of course the people who don't like it say it's socialist, it has a left-wing agenda or whatever. But if the people's side of the story is socialist, whatever, who cares?
Well, we have socialism for corporations going on in our country. We have welfare for the rich. We have corporations not paying taxes, okay? So I think some sort of blend of socialism and capitalism has always been kind of an ideal thing, or capitalism with a human face, you might want to call it. Maybe even thinking of some spiritual values also. I don't know if you're spiritual, if you go into that direction, but certainly a world based on love and caring. This is something that's always been very important to me. I belong to the Network of Spiritual Progressives, which is founded by Michael Lerner and Cornel West, and just trying to think of a world that's based on humanity and love and caring, because there's a lot of madness going on now. This warfare state that's just, one of the things that Chomsky said when he spoke at the Left Forum was even the possibility of a Dr. Strangelove situation where some rogue general would get a hold of a nuclear weapon or something. And I think we need to be educating for this, and I don't see us really doing that, but I see you, David, as a very humanitarian person, as a gentle soul, but with a fierce intellect. I was aware of you when I first moved to Hoboken in the 1980s, and Hoboken had been a working class town beginning to gentrify, and just there was a feeling in your bookstore, there was a feeling and a presence about you that this was a man who was a strong man, who was an intelligent man, and you created that space, that intellectual space around you, and it's still very strong today, because you have so many varied interests. You're very eclectic. I remember having a conversation once with David in the park. I don't know if you remember it, but both our daughters were small. We were at Columbus Park in Hoboken, and I had begun to get interested in existentialism, and I was very confused about the topic. This is before I had gotten a master's degree at NYU in education, and my education was very nascent and emerging. I had dropped out of Fordham. I was a literature major. Then I got back to college to finish that. But the presence of your bookstore, I think, was always, for me, part of a kind of a curriculum. A community curriculum of places that you can walk into. That's why I think bookstores matter. I'm happy that we're taping in a bookstore right now. This is a bookstore that I had conversations with 10 years ago. I started a discussion group with Cornel and Carmen Rusu, the wonderful owners who are from Romania, and they really were very open to this idea of a dialogic space. It was a weekly discussion. They provided the food, and I showed up and facilitated it. We had this open discussion and dialogue. But I want to go back to our conversation in the park, which was very meaningful for me at that time. And I said, wow, I'm talking to David Cogswell, the David Cogswell, the owner of Rogers and Cogswell, this great intellectual man. And this is before you even wrote books. This is before your books had come out. So we had that sort of existential encounter in the park. I actually had a copy of your book, Existential for Beginners. I bought it 3 years ago, and I had it in my backpack. And I was also reading at the time Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, and I went to a place in New York called the Fat Black Pussycat, and I had a drink, and I went to the bathroom, and I left my backpack. I came back, and the backpack was gone. So this was an existential. I have to get back and finish reading your book. Talk a little bit, David, about how you've grown philosophically, intellectually. I don't know anything about your background in terms of what you studied. I'm very curious, like where you went to school, or if you're an autodidact, and how did you, growing up, how did you become the intellectual being you are, with such caring about the world and having such a humanitarian side to you?
Wow, that's a hard question. It's sort of like life story, which is a long one, but anyone's life story is. So I'm trying to think. Where to begin? I think. I came from Kansas. Now Kansas was not, to me, anything like it is now, and I think to other people who live in Kansas has unfortunately been taken over by rogue, wild Republicans, and it was a Republican state in those days, and in fact my father was a Republican politician in those days. But it didn't mean the same thing as it does now at all. My father was a World War II vet. He was on the Omaha Beach in Normandy, and he met my mother, who was an English woman living in Southampton at the time. So when he then came back to the United States afterwards and actually went to law school and started a political career and so forth. He became a judge, and he was the youngest judge in America. He was 26, and he was the judge of the probate court, and he liberalized the court. He was like, they set up a juvenile division, and they changed it so that the juveniles would not get police records, and they would be treated not in a punitive way, but in a way to try to help them. And it was what now you would consider very liberal. It wasn't the same world, and Republican Party was not Eisenhower was the president. It was a very, very different world. So, and I lived in Topeka, which at that time was, of course, it's the capital of Kansas, but it was also the home of the Menninger Foundation, which was the mental health sort of. It made it a mental health capital, and people. Many distinguished people, not only as patients but also as therapists and writers and so forth, came there because of that, and it engendered a nice community that there was like theater and different things like that were in the community. It was nothing like it is now, but it still wasn't. I always longed to go to places. I always wanted to come to New York. So New York has kind of everything, but so in terms of I grew up really my parents split up when I was young, and I grew up in an English household, so we were basically foreigners. I had a single mother, and we were foreigners, so in Kansas, in the middle of the United States. So I was always an outsider, and I think and I learned a lot of my values actually from both my parents, but as I say, Republican values weren't what they are now. So anyway, it's a very, very long story.
Formal education?
Well, I went to the University of Kansas. I actually dropped out before I graduated, so that's I'm a dropout.
What were you studying?
Well, I studied. I started out as an English major. I became a design major, and I ended up being like a mass communications major. But I was kind of interested in everything, but the politics was very stormy at the time, and it was kind of overshadowed my school experience. So.
I just read your essay on Dostoevsky's Ghost, where you had a very strange encounter in the home where Dostoevsky lived in St. Petersburg, and the way you wrote, you just capture, the how much Dostoevsky means to you as a writer. So, and apparently you've read a lot of his books, and so it seems to me that you're very self-taught. Would that be true to say you're an autodidact?
I hate to use that word because there's a character in Jean-Paul Sartre's Nausea, the autodidact, and it's not somebody you want to be. But so probably all a little of each. You only learn by going to the masters, whether you read their books or whether you talk to people. So you don't really educate yourself exactly, but at the same time, even if you're a student, it's up to you to educate yourself to a large degree. So I'm not a conventionally educated person anyway, and I have gone my own way. I lived as a musician for many years, and I traveled as a musician, and I did a lot of reading and studying during that time. So it's...
We're trying to figure out here, David, because we're in a crisis in our country. We're in an educational crisis, and we're trying to figure out, even the people watching us now, if people have not had sufficient educations, which is true, and if they've been sort of propagandized in this right-wing model that the free market is, the cat's meow and you can't criticize authority and all that stuff, and lack of knowledge of art and culture. I mean, you lived this life. You were a musician. You were around a very creative milieu, and I'm just trying to figure out, I'm thinking out loud outside the box, and all I can think of is we need to create spaces, or cultural spaces, or social spaces where people can get together. I think we definitely need a shorter work week as well. I ran for president last year. I didn't get any votes, but I ran. Basically for just, you know what it was? It was for self-therapy. I was getting so depressed watching Obama and Romney and watching this farce that I said, I got to take to the streets with this, theatrical, whatever you want to call it, giving out flyers. Hi, I'm John Bredin, running for president, But one of the things I talked about was the need for a shorter work week, a 25-hour work week. People are just exhausted. They're overworked. They're working, and you can see it in Hoboken. You can see the whole people coming up Washington Street. You could feel there's an alienation. People got their iPods plugged in. They're not looking at each other, talking to each other. Even cafe life is getting boring. I'm telling you, I love going to cafes, and I'm not going to mention any cafe by name, but sometimes you go into a cafe and the people sitting there, they're on their laptops, or they're having discussions that are just really, to me, not really interesting. Very banal. There's a banality in our society. Christopher Lotch called it the minimalist self. He was a philosopher, that we're becoming very small, and I think this is a function of education. We're trying to educate the public, and you're a person who has done an amazing job in writing these books for beginners. I think that's what it's about. Is a lot of people feel intimidated by someone like a Noam Chomsky, and they wouldn't want to jump into his texts. So reading a book like Chomsky for beginners, or existentialism for beginners, people can start. But I really think that we need to talk about these things and process them and have dialogues. If you ever want to have a salon, David, we'll be there, and show up with our camera. My dream is to create these salons. This is why we call the show the Public Voice Salon. And do you remember a time, David, in our country, in your lifetime, when people hung out more and had these kind of discussions? Let's go back to maybe the 70s, or what has been the change in terms of conversation life in our country?
It's a great point, and the whole the control system, the power system, functions on exactly the things that you're saying you don't want, and of course that's why it will be very hard to institute any of those things. I mean, people are overworked, they're underpaid, they're afraid of losing their jobs, they're afraid that if they say something that's not cool and it's public, then they could get fired. If you don't have your job, you don't have health insurance. So for survival, you have to hold on, and this all serves the purposes of what I've been referring to as the corporate state, but however you call the 1%, it doesn't serve the people very much. So I'm in total agreement that we need, unfortunately, given the situation, we each have to individually make whatever efforts we can to pick ourselves up by our bootstraps and educate ourselves in spite of efforts to propagandize and program you and indoctrinate you. You need to look beyond that. It's funny because you mentioned something you said brought to mind. I remember the first Mothers of Invention album, the Frank Zappa album, and the notes on that album were as good or better than the album itself. And I remember on there, one of the things that Zappa wrote is, drop out of school and educate yourself if you've got any guts. But obviously it's pretty hard to drop out of the system in general. You may have guts, but you do have to survive. It's very difficult. So, but within the limits that we have to try to educate ourselves beyond what we're being sort of programmed to think. And the point of the discussions, it's so important. People have to get out. I mean, that's one example, reason why I think in Egypt you could have half the population out on the street, and here you might get 1/10 of the population out in a really bad situation. It's people are. That's what Chomsky talked about a lot. We're successfully blocked off from each other. Before we had iPhones and computers, we had television, and people were in little separate cubicles around and not talking, and that's, again, serves the purposes of this sort of dehumanizing corporate state. It doesn't, it's not a good community for human beings, which is increasingly the problem. You know, it's a question, do you want a country that serves people or that serves corporations? And we're losing, but I see a lot of hope.
We have the Occupy Wall Street movement, which I think is a sign of hope, and that could manifest in something else going forward. You wrote somewhere about Norman Mailer, a quote from Mailer about existential politics and the fact that Martin Luther King, after he did what he did, there was a shift, there was a change, just doing things. And I think just saying things, even taking it down to the micro level of a conversation, being at a party and daring to bring up a topic, you know, or with a friend or something like that, or with a stranger, you know, it creates an energy, it creates ripple effects that go out. We're in a big crisis here, and I think even the wealthy and the elites, I think they're starting to wake up and realize that this wonderful book by Ralph Nader called "Only the Super Rich Can Save Us," and it's basically a fiction. He wrote a novel, you know, just imagining what if one day the wealthy elites got together and said, "Hey, we've got to pitch in here," you know, because it's you know, the time is running out here, you know, like the Wizard of Oz when the hourglass is turned over and the sands are running down. We don't have much time. And I recently, David, I hope you don't get mad at me, but I recently got my real estate license because I want to make a buck. I know there are aspects of real estate that are very corrupt, and I'm trying to be an advocate for change even there. In the corporate world, I created an organization called the Ethical Business Society to try to push back on the right-wing hegemony in corporate America, and we have about 35 members, and you know, we're slowly growing. I wrote a book called The Ethical Sales Agent, and the subtitle is A Transformative Sales Pedagogy to Liberate Corporate Culture and Save America. So the idea is, like, we can have these conversations even at the water cooler, you know, in between the cubicles, and people can say things. And there's a philosopher named Maxine Green who I learned a lot from. She's actually 95 years old. She still teaches a class at Columbia University, and she was basically inculcated in a Deweyan philosophy, which is very pragmatist, which is very social justice oriented, which is very dialogical, you know. And she says it's important to imagine things as if they could be otherwise. Just that ability, the imagination, you know, and the importance of dialogue, and the importance of discussion, the importance of wide awakeness. And she mentions the arts a lot, you know, and Emily Dickinson talked about how the arts, they light the slow fuse of the possible, you know, and I know you're a very creative, very artistic person as well. You know, and then she says, Maxine, she talks about the gaps or the interstices. It reminds me of what you just said, that even if you think that the system is completely closed and even fascistic, there's some wiggle room. You can always open up a space. You can, you know, and I think we're in that time now, but you know, with what just happened in Egypt, I can't help but thinking this is a huge opening. You have liberation movements going on. You have what happened in Texas recently, where people, you know, basically they overwhelmed the Texas courthouse there, and they preached against this right-wing birth control thing that was going on. So where there's life, there's hope. Where there's people, there's hope. And I think, but David, you really bring this kind of humane and intellectual sort of way of being together. I don't see you as being an argumentative person. I can't imagine David arguing with anybody, you know. But do you ever get into trouble? I mean, do you ever get into situations where you wind up holding and not speaking, or how do you handle people in situations that are critical? Or
wow. Well, there are many discussions that aren't necessarily worth having. I mean, you can't always like change people's minds or even get an idea through to anybody. So a lot of things just kind of go by. I think we're all challenged to find that balance, because if you're just fighting with people and you're head-to-head, screaming or whatever, I mean, you're not getting anywhere. And if you're completely passive and don't say anything, then you might as well not exist, I guess. But so there's somewhere in between where hopefully you can, it's like they say of choose your battles. You can maybe make a difference here and there with a kind word or an insightful word, maybe. That reminds me of that Dostoevsky quote that we were talking about earlier, which is from The Idiot, that is one of my favorite quotes. And just to sum it up, it talks about how you can never underestimate the value of a single act of courage, of charity, the kindness from one person to another, and you can never know exactly the effect, the ripples of that act will have on the destiny of humanity. So we're all looking for our opportunities to make a difference. The Norman Mailer quote you mentioned was, I thought, such a brilliant quote, and which is why I had to share that. He talks about how Martin Luther King's a particular action I think he picked out, but it applies to pretty much what he did in general. He said it was existential because it was the kind of thing that in taking that action you could not know what the result would be. But in doing it, that would change the situation itself. So, like the woman who refused to go to the back of the bus, that was an existential act she could not possibly know. It's taking that existential leap into something, the future is unknown, but by taking that leap, you gain a power. It gives you a power, and that you only get by the act of will of taking that leap. But then when then the result is to change the situation. So it did. When Martin Luther King changed the world, he changed the way people dealt with it. Who could imagine that the weak and impoverished and marginalized, unarmed people would have any power? He managed to find a way to use a moral stance and the attention of the world to create power where there was none. So he is one of the greats. We don't have very many. I was noticing recently Mandela, of course, is in discussion because he's ailing. I don't think there are many on the canvas today who rise to anything like that level. Mandela's a really fine, high-level moral leader. There aren't many like that. And Martin Luther King, half a century ago, somebody who really rises above the crowd and makes a real contribution.
I want to say how much I'm learning right now just from having this conversation with you, David, and I think once again this shows the power of conversation and of sharing and of dialogue, and how I think more people ought to get together in their living rooms and in their cafes and have these kind of discussions and talks, some of the people we've had on our show include Stanley Aronowitz, who has also written about unions and education, and we had Edith Kurzweil, who was the former editor of Partisan Review, which was a great intellectual magazine of the 20th century. I published a letter in the Reporter this week. It's in the same edition that yours is, where I talk about the need for Hudson County. We're in Hudson County, New Jersey now, to have its own intellectual magazine, that there are enough intellects and artists and thinkers around to get together and maybe have a quarterly or something like that. But it's so powerful and empowering to talk to you, and I wish I'm always thinking about how can we expand the dialogue, how can we expand the circle and the conversation. I invite people watching us at home, to send an email and be a part of, future discussions and in groups, and we can. Because you don't see this modeled even on television, right? Television has become very fake and scripted, and even CNBC, it's like a very formatted. I get tired of watching it, So where do we get our information? Obviously, Bill Moyers, I think, is great. I think Charlie Rose is also very good. He has some really great guests. He recently had Rick Wolff on, who's a Marxist economist, who has a new book called Democracy at Work, where he says that the workforce needs to be democratized, that the workforce is actually the most autocratic place that you can think of, and in a country that espouses democracy, how can you have the fact that people are spending most of their times in a place that's dictatorial? That doesn't make any sense. And he talks about Mondragon in Spain, which is these worker co-ops, and we can move in that direction. So there are ideas out there, there are solutions, but we need to. Do you think, though, David, we could actually move into a political formation on this in terms of, I know the Democratic Party, it's going to be a tough job reforming them, but I belong to a political club in New York, the Village Independent Democrats, so I try to hang in with the most liberal wing, and one of our members, her name is Keen Berger, she's the district leader of Greenwich Village. Her dad was Harold Stassen, who was a liberal Republican, governor of Minnesota, and he was probably way further to the left now than any Democrat, even though he was a Republican. So, like you said, there was one time a liberal force, even within the Republican Party. But what can we do on a nuts and bolts level politically? Do you see any hope in the Green Party, maybe, or?
I think it is really hard in this country because the two-party system is so locked down, and it isn't like parliamentary systems where a smaller group can get in there and can build its way up. It is very, very difficult. But there is, as you said before, where there's life, there's hope. And when you see something like what went on in Egypt, both July 3rd and also a year and a half ago with the original Arab Spring, you see, I always remember the fall of the Berlin Wall. And to remind myself that almost, you don't know what can happen. What you think is impossible can happen. And as I've talked to people who lived in Berlin at the time and who said that, 6 weeks before the Berlin Wall fell, we thought, oh, well, maybe sometime, probably not in my lifetime. 6 weeks later, it was down. I talked to a friend who described to me what it was like that day. And my God, what a moving experience just to hear about it. It's like these things, amazing things can happen. And that's why the power structure in this country is so very, very harsh right now. And if you have a few people go out and demonstrate, you'll have a military police group out there that are so frightening, and if they don't actually beat them and gas them or whatever they do, they still are very, very scary. But that's because that power, that latent power, is enormous. It's huge. So it's hard to say in a world like this where things are changing constantly. Even the forms of our media are evolving very rapidly, and the incidents around the world everything is evolving very rapidly, and there's a connection around the world that there never was before. So now we see the people's movement in Brazil, the people's movement in all these different places, going on all the time right now, and it's like there's a lot of potential, and that's. So the people who are holding the power, as invincible as they seem, they're very frightened of all this.
Bringing so much hope. I'm so happy that you're on our show and that this is going out to the airwaves, and people watching it can be nurtured and nourished with some kind of positive energy, because today it can feel very depressing and hopeless, especially if you only follow the mainstream media. But I wanted to cover, before we finish, I know we've talked a lot about a lot of heavy politics and things like that, and maybe this can connect to politics in some way, but the fact that you've traveled so extensively, Dave, that's another whole part of your life, that you've become a travel writer and you've been to so many different places around the world. Maybe you could talk to, just explain a little bit about that and about how things you've seen and the places you've been, and as brief as you can, just to sort of summarize some of those travel experiences, how that's opened up your consciousness and opened up some different possibilities.
Well, so the last 15 years I've been able to work as a reporter for the travel industry. So it has given me an opportunity to take trips I hate to say all over the world, because as soon as you say all over the world, of course, it's really a very small part of the world. But I've been to Antarctica, I've been, Russia, China, Egypt, Africa, a lot in Africa, a lot of places, the Middle East, and it's wonderful. I mean, it does help to open your perspectives to what can happen. And for example, as I mentioned at the library discussion you talked about recently, I've seen countries that are kingdoms, that are sheikdoms, that seem to have more humanity for their population than our government does towards our population. When you look closely, you look beyond the media at what's really going on now with like people being, of course there's been many foreclosures, and now people are getting pushed off of their food stamps and unemployment insurance, and it's a very brutal world out there. And it seems to me that our country, unfortunately, I hate to say it, it really is of, by, and for the corporations. And it may be, for example, some of these United Arab Republics are based on, they're sheikdoms. They're like a kingdom. But there used to be noblesse oblige. The royalty recognized a responsibility to take care of the people in some measure, and that's not really here anymore. We have this sort of soulless corporate state that's running things, and they don't recognize any obligation to anything. So it definitely, when I see the news, I always have a lot of counter perspective to look at it with, because I've been in a lot of these places and I've seen what they're really like, as opposed to what we're being told.
Maybe we can have more of a multicultural dialogue and invite in people from different nationalities to speak about these things. One of the people who spoke at the Left Forum this year was the Vice President of Bolivia, who was a socialist. And as we saw in the news just, I think, yesterday, the President of Bolivia, his plane was held up because they thought that the Snowden was on there, and so it's like a big insult to South America. And my wife Claudia, who's from Colombia, South America, we see also how a lot of the examples of oppression that America has visited upon other parts of the world, in Nicaragua during the Reagan administration, in Chile with the coup that was backed by the U.S. and the CIA, and all of this stuff I think needs to be part of a national, international dialogue of how can we move towards a world that's based on love, that's based on caring, that's based on relationship, where we can get beyond warfare, we can outlaw warfare. There was actually talk after World War I of actually abolishing warfare. People like John Dewey, they were involved in this very utopian type of ideals, and it seems like we've lost all that. Back in the 60s and 70s, they said all you need is love. You had John Lennon, you had this kind of hope and idealism, and it seems like that's been put down. It seems like the right wing has mobilized to crush that, and we're living in that now. We're living in the result of that students aren't radical anymore. They've become depoliticized. The universities are depoliticized, and so what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's well put, well explained. I think I discovered, as I was working on the Unions book, this thing called the Powell Doctrine, which was in the early 70s when Nixon was president. Powell, I forget his first name now. Was it Lewis? Okay, he presented a memo which was a call to arms to big business, and basically thought that what at that time was the sort of leading edge of the New Deal politics, which had then come to a place where you had like occupational safety, environmental protection. These things were evolving under Nixon even. And Powell put out this thing and said, we cannot, he called these things an assault on the free enterprise system. And he thought that business was being put down so badly. They had to rise up and organize themselves and fight back, which they did very effectively. And Nixon appointed Powell a Supreme Court justice, which was handy but there was also the National Business Coalition, something like that. Oh, okay. So, but in any case, it was a very well thought out campaign to take over the country and push back the New Deal, and it's been very well done.
Well, I'm trying my best with this Ethical Business Society. I started to push back and to decolonize the corporate space, the hegemony, the right-wing energy. I'm so happy, David, that you're with us today. I hope this is only a beginning. There's so much we could go on and talk about. And I feel like we're in this soiree. I feel like David should preside over his own salon, and really, I mean, these things need to be out there and talked about, and you're such a wonderful communicator and so articulate and kind and gentle, and I hope this is only a beginning and we can continue to talk about this amongst ourselves and also with other people, bringing other people in. Again, we're in the Symposia Bookstore, a great community space here in Hoboken, and Carmen and Cornell Russo let us film here, and they're very supportive of this. Looking out the window, you can see Claudia, show the camera. There's the street. There's the sidewalk. That's the, John Dewey called it the great community. Martin Luther King called it the beloved community. But this is what we're working on. And so thank you so much, David, for being on our show today. And be well, and more good writing in the future.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you very much. My pleasure.